Come, sit for a moment, and let's slip together through the thin, trembling veil of time. Not into some dusty chapter of a textbook, but into an era that still beats with a startlingly human pulse. Tonight, we're diving straight into a world blazing with possibility, yet stalked by growing darkness. A world where joy and despair walked hand in hand. Let yourself feel the shift, a faint tremble of jazz drifting from a basement bar, the whisper of cold night air sliding through narrow streets, the restless hum of a city that never truly slept. This isn't a staged scene from an old film reel. This was real, raw, alive, bohemian. Paris in the 1920s, where genius and self-destruction danced dangerously close, each step reshaping the culture we live in today. But pause for a moment and ask yourself, how could an entire generation celebrated for creating some of humanity's most brilliant masterpieces slide so easily toward its own unraveling? It's a contradiction that almost doesn't make sense until you look closer. The truth hides in the smoke-choked corners of Parisian cafés, where absinthe glowed like a wicked green lantern and heroin slipped into daily life with the casualness of a morning croissant. What I'm about to show you will tear apart every romantic myth you've ever believed about the tortured artist chasing inspiration in exotic ways. These weren't just creative minds experimenting with new muses. They were wounded survivors caught in a perfect storm, the psychological wreckage of war, a furious rebellion against old-world traditions, and a shockingly open floodgate of powerful narcotics. Mix these together, and the city of light transforms into something far stranger, something brilliant. Yes, but also quietly poisoned. Tonight, I'm taking you deep inside that hidden world maze of heroin dens that disguised themselves as sanctuaries for artists. You'll step into the same rooms, breathe the same heavy air, and feel the same creeping sense of danger that those real people once lived with every day. We'll expose how simple cafes evolved into finely tuned drug networks, how addiction threaded itself through entire communities, and why the most dazzling artistic boom in Parisian history was also its most catastrophically self-destructive. And before we push open the door to those cramped rooms where clinking glasses mixed with the faint gasp of fading dreams, let me set the stage. Let me draw the wider picture, because only then will you understand how Paris became, in one strange twist of fate, both the beating heart of an artistic revolution and the epicenter of a quiet, devastating narcotic collapse. The Great War had only recently receded, leaving behind a scarred continent and an entire generation of young men, many barely out of boyhood, searching desperately for meaning in a world utterly broken. These veterans, having witnessed unspeakable horrors in the muddy, blood-soaked trenches, returned home to a life that simply no longer fit. It felt alien, suffocating. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a fresh wave of wealthy Americans, eager to escape their own country's prohibition and moral strictures, surged into Paris. They arrived with overflowing pockets, yes, but also with a voracious, reckless appetite for excess, a hunger for anything new, anything forbidden. This explosive collision, trauma meeting wealth, rebellion clashing with opportunity, forged the perfect conditions for what would become one of history's most audacious and dangerous cultural experiments. The dimly lit cafés of Montmartre and Montparnasse weren't just doling out espresso and flaky croissants anymore. They were dealing in something far more intoxicating, something infinitely more ruinous. Now, allow me to introduce you to Jean-Baptiste Marot. Picture him, a young painter, barely 24, arriving in Paris one spring morning, likely amidst a flurry of cherry blossoms, with nothing but a well-worn suitcase and a soul-burning dream of becoming the next Picasso. Jean-Baptiste had miraculously survived Verdun, that brutal hellscape, but the gnawing, vivid nightmares clung to him, following him like a persistent shadow to his tiny, cramped studio apartment near Saker. See your sleep became an elusive luxury, a tormenting memory. So he began to seek solace, or perhaps just oblivion, frequenting the notorious Café de l'Amour, a place where the coffee was famously bitter and the real business, the unspoken transactions, truly began long after midnight. It was within the murky bohemian haze of this very café that Jean-Baptiste first encountered the needle, not as a sterile instrument of medicine, you understand, but as a treacherous gateway, a whispered promise to a world where the relentless screaming inside his head finally, miraculously, fell silent. The café's owner, a mysterious woman shrouded in whispers and known only as Madame Neuer, possessed a network of connections that ran far deeper, far darker than anyone dared to suspect. She wasn't merely serving drinks and polite conversation. She was serving escape, an intoxicating balm for shattered souls. Within mere weeks, Jean-Baptiste's artistic output exploded. His canvases, once timid, now pulsated with an otherworldly quality, teeming with dreamlike imagery and a raw emotional intensity that critics would later hail as revolutionary. But what those admiring critics couldn't possibly know, what they couldn't see past the vibrant strokes of genius, was that each masterpiece was meticulously paid for with a piece of his very soul. Each brushstroke, each flash of color, bought with a dose of German-manufactured heroin that coursed through the café like a silent, toxic river. Jean-Baptiste, of course, was hardly an isolated case. The Café de l'Amour, with its flickering gaslight and hushed conversations, attracted a rotating cast of damaged souls, American expatriates fleeing conservative families and prohibition, seeking a different kind of freedom. British poets, their eyes wide with a desperate hunger for inspiration. German intellectuals escaping political turmoil, and countless French artists like Jean-Baptiste desperately trying to forget the recent unspeakable horrors of the war. They initially came for the vibrant atmosphere, the intellectual frisson, but they stayed, inevitably, for the drugs. Madame Noir, with her shrewd gaze, understood something profound, something that modern drug dealers still shamelessly exploit to this very day. Creative people, she knew, make absolutely excellent customers. They often possess just enough money to comfortably maintain a habit, are inherently inclined towards experimentation and pushing boundaries, and perhaps most dangerously, they possess a formidable capacity to rationalize their addiction, convincing themselves it is an essential, even sacred, component of their artistic process. She didn't need to push her product. She simply cultivated an environment where its consumption felt utterly, beautifully, terribly inevitable. The café itself operated on multiple, almost clandestine levels. To the casual observer, perhaps a tourist or a new patron, it appeared to be nothing more than another charming bohemian gathering spot where earnest young artists discussed philosophy over cheap wine and strong tobacco. But if you possessed the right words, if you understood the subtle, knowing gestures, if you were acquainted with the right hushed voices, you could effortlessly slip into a parallel world. Here, within these very walls, heroin wasn't measured in mere grams. It was exchanged, almost ritually, for artistic inspiration, for a temporary balm for the soul. Regular customers, initiates into this dark fraternity, developed an elaborate, unspoken code. Ordering the special coffee meant you were requesting opium, its sweet, heavy scent soon to fill your senses. Asking for sugar with extra sweetness was the discreet code for cocaine, promising a jolt of manic energy. But heroin, the most coveted, the most deeply destructive of all, demanded the most subtle, the most poetic of approaches. You simply, quietly, asked if the painter's supplies were available today. The bitter irony of it all, you see, was rarely lost on anyone involved. These were individuals who proudly viewed themselves as fierce rebels against bourgeois society, against its stifling conventions and hypocrisy. Yet, they were meticulously crafting their own rigid, unforgiving hierarchy, one built entirely upon drug access and a perverse interpretation of artistic credibility. The deeper you plunged into the abyss of addiction, the more authentic your art was considered to be. Sobriety, in this shadowed world, became synonymous with selling out. Consider the tragic tale of Margaret Worthington. She was a Boston socialite, a beacon of old money, who had arrived in Paris in 1924, clutching a substantial trust fund and a head full of romantic, idealistic notions about supporting struggling artists. She rented a spacious, elegant apartment in the 6th arrondissement, its windows overlooking charming Parisian streets, and quickly began hosting lavish salons. Here, amidst the clinking of crystal and the murmur of French, she would proudly showcase the work of promising young painters and eloquent writers. Margaret initially saw herself as a latter-day Medici, a sophisticated patroness, nurturing the next brilliant generation of creative genius. She frequented gallery openings, purchased paintings from unknown artists with genuine enthusiasm, and prided herself on her exquisite, discerning taste. But sophistication in 1920s Paris, particularly within these circles, was quickly beginning to mean something far more. Understanding the theoretical nuances of cubism, or deciphering the labyrinthine depths of stream of consciousness literature. No, for you, a deeper plunge awaited. When you first stepped into the hushed, smoky elegance of Café de l'Art, you were ushered into a world where artistic appreciation transcended mere contemplation, a place where it took on a startlingly physical dimension. The paintings adorning the walls weren't just observed. They were experienced their hues and forms allegedly unlocking profound insights through chemical enhancements that promised a direct conduit to the artist's very soul. And the poetry, it wasn't merely listened to, it was felt absorbed into your very being by potent substances whispered to open new vistas of consciousness. Your own transformation, you'd recall later, began almost imperceptibly, a slow, deliberate drift. Initially, you'd sample opium during those enchanting evening salons, a casual indulgence. You'd rationalize it, of course, telling yourself it was purely for research, an immersive journey into the artistic process. But within mere months, the delicate tendrils of curiosity had tightened into an inescapable grip, and you, my friend, had graduated to heroin, convinced that genuine understanding of the art required an intimate, personal experience with the very drug that inspired it. Your once elegant apartment, slowly, chillingly, began its own transformation. It evolved into a discrete node within an ever-expanding network of distribution, its bohemian charm now serving a far more sinister purpose. Artists would arrive ostensibly to display their latest masterpieces, the scent of turpentine mingling with something sharper, something more urgent. But, let's be honest, you knew their true purpose: to score their next fix. You would purchase their canvases, not out of a genuine love for the work, though some pieces truly captivated you, but because buying art provided the perfect, unimpeachable disguise for these illicit transactions. A painting barely worth 50 francs would change hands for 500, the exorbitant markup precisely covering the cost of the heroin changing hands. The sheer genius of this elaborate system lay in its deniability, a shimmering shield of plausible innocence. Should the authorities ever come knocking, everyone involved, from the most lauded painter to the casual collector, could simply claim to be participating in the entirely legitimate art market. The drugs, they would argue with a straight face, were merely incidental, a fleeting part of the vibrant, experimental atmosphere that made such groundbreaking art possible. But the grim reality, you knew, was far darker, a cold chill that settled deep in your bones. Your trust fund, once a comforting bulwark against the world, was being systematically bled dry, not just to feed your own burgeoning addiction, but to sustain the habits of an entire clandestine network of artists and dealers. Your health, once robust, deteriorated with an alarming swiftness. Your judgment, sharp and discerning, became irrevocably compromised. That vibrant apartment, once a sanctuary for intellectual exchange and artistic discourse, morphed before your very eyes, transforming from a salon into a thinly veiled shooting gallery, its artistic pretense now a mere whisper against the backdrop of desperate need. But perhaps the most profound tragedy was the insidious way addiction poisoned the art itself. While the initial flirtation with drugs might have, for some, momentarily ignited a spark of creativity, prolonged heroin addiction had precisely the opposite effect. The very inspiration that drew these tortured souls to the drug in the first place eventually evaporated. It left them hollow, creating art solely to fund their next agonizing fix, a grim, cyclical pantomime. Jean-Baptiste's story, you remembered vividly, illustrated this perfectly, a stark, heartbreaking example. His early heroin-influenced paintings had been truly revolutionary, hadn't they? Bursting with raw emotional complexity and visual innovation, they captivated serious collectors, drawing them in like moths to a flame. But as his addiction deepened its claws, his work became distressingly formulaic, a tired echo of its former brilliance. He found himself churning out the same dreamlike imagery over and over again, not because it expressed his evolving artistic vision, but because those were the only asterisk paintings that still sold to the drug-using collectors who frequented these shadowy cafés. The economic ecosystem was entirely circular, you realized with a shiver, and ultimately unsustainable. Artists used drugs to create their art, then sold that art to buy more drugs, in turn attracting buyers who were themselves using drugs to appreciate the very art being created. Money flowed in endless, dizzying loops, yet real value, true artistic merit, was being systematically destroyed at every step. The art grew less innovative, its spark dimming. The artists, once brilliant, became less capable, their hands trembling, their vision clouded, and the buyers, their perceptions dulled by their own habits, grew less discerning. Meanwhile, figures like Madame Noir, their faces inscrutable, were getting obscenely rich, orchestrating this slow-motion destruction. They positioned themselves, with an almost theatrical flourish, as cultural facilitators, the guardians of the avant-garde. But, between you and me, they were simply running sophisticated drug operations, cloaking their illicit enterprise under a thin veneer of artistic pretension. The café, you had to admit, provided the perfect front. its irregular hours, its wonderfully eclectic clientele, and a culture that openly celebrated nonconformity made it nearly impossible for the authorities to distinguish between legitimate artistic activity and blatant criminal enterprise. Oh, and let's not forget the international flavor of the clientele, a most convenient form of protection. When wealthy Americans or British aristocrats were involved, local police were remarkably reluctant to investigate too aggressively, weren't they? Diplomatic complaints, you quickly learned, could swiftly end careers, and there was always that invaluable, plausible deniability about what was truly transpiring within these establishments. This fostered a dangerously potent sense of invulnerability among the participants, a belief that would prove tragically misplaced. They genuinely believed their artistic credentials and elevated social connections made them untouchable, failing to grasp the simple, brutal truth. Addiction, my friend, does not respect class boundaries or creative talent. By the year 1925, the insidious network had spiraled far beyond individual cafés. What began as scattered pockets of daring artistic experimentation had metastasized, evolving into a sophisticated underground economy that stretched its shadowy tendrils across the entire left bank. The heroin trade, cunning and pervasive, had found its perfect camouflage in the very heart of bohemian cafe culture. And the results, you had to admit, were both magnificent in their audacity and utterly horrifying in their human cost. Consider, if you will, the evening routine at Lasciani Fiume, a cafe that sprawled across 3 floors of a crumbling ancient building tucked away near the Sorbonne, its stone facade whispering forgotten tales. The ground floor, you would notice, painstakingly maintained an illusion of respectability. Here, earnest students debated philosophy over cheap, earthy wine, their voices a low hum. Tourists, eager for a taste of authentic French atmosphere, snapped photos and sampled local fare, while venerable intellectuals held court at their regular, worn tables, surrounded by the comforting aroma of coffee and galoises. But as the night deepened, and the casual customers began their slow, meandering departure into the chill Parisian air, the real business, the true purpose of Lasciani Fiume would quietly begin to unfurl like a dark bloom in the shadows. The second floor, accessible only through a narrow, almost secret staircase hidden cleverly behind a bookshelf, housed what the regulars, with a knowing wink, simply called the laboratory. Here, an American expatriate chemist turned dealer, a man known simply as Robert Bobby Chen, had set up an operation that would honestly make modern drug cartels green with envy. Bobby had initially arrived in Paris with impeccable credentials, a chemistry degree from Harvard, no less, and ambitious plans to conduct legitimate research at the prestigious Sorbonne. Instead, fate, or perhaps a darker inclination, led him to cook heroin in makeshift labs, leveraging his scientific training to conjure increasingly pure and alarmingly potent products. Bobby's clientele weren't your typical street addicts, desperate and shaking for their next hit. No, these were discerning consumers, often artists themselves, who demanded not only quality but absolute consistency. A batch that was too weak could plunge artists into agonizing withdrawal during crucial creative periods, stifling their muse. Too strong and valuable customers might tragically overdose, their lives extinguished before they could even complete their commissioned works. Bobby approached drug manufacturing with the same meticulous precision he had once applied to legitimate scientific research. Isn't that just like history? He kept detailed, almost obsessive notes on potency levels, customer reactions, and optimal dosing schedules, a terrifying inversion of scientific endeavor. The third floor of Lachan served a dual, grim purpose, both gallery and shooting gallery. Paintings, some breathtaking, some disturbingly raw, hung on walls that had witnessed countless injections, their colors seeming to shift and dance with a hallucinatory quality in the dim, flickering gaslight. Artists would arrive, their eyes a mixture of hope and desperation, cradling their latest works, hoping to trade canvas for powder. The unspoken rule was brutal in its simplicity. The quality of the art directly determined the quantity of drugs received, creating a perverse market where artistic merit was measured in the cold, hard currency of milligrams of heroin. This chilling system, you understood, attracted some genuinely talented individuals, souls who might well have achieved true greatness without the chemical crutch. Élise Dubois, a sculptor from Lyon, for instance, possessed an extraordinary natural ability that had earned her recognition in legitimate galleries across Europe. But the war, that relentless destroyer of innocence, had claimed her fiancé. With him, shattered her faith. You step into her dimly lit studio, the air thick with the earthy scent of wet clay and the faint, sweet sickly tang of something less natural. Eliza, a woman of quiet intensity who had sought the anonymity of Paris, not for glory, but for a balm to a deeper pain, worked with an almost terrifying focus. Her hands, stained with the malleable earth, moved in a hypnotic rhythm, shaping figures that seemed less sculpted than coaxed into being. Under the pervasive haze of her secret vice, her creations transcended mere art. They were raw conduits of emotion, speaking of nameless griefs, the hollow ache of survival, and humanity's desperate clutch for meaning amidst the chaos of existence. You watch as her forms emerge, capturing the very essence of human despair, the weight of a senseless loss, the profound exhaustion of having outlived others, the gnawing hunger for purpose when the world itself felt fundamentally unhinged. Gallery owners, you see, were captivated, selling her pieces for staggering sums. Collectors claimed to feel the very tremor of the artist's suffering radiating from the cold clay. What they didn't realize, what you now grasp, is that they were quite literally purchasing a piece of someone's pain, an aesthetic experience commodified and delivered straight from the crucible of narcotic addiction. Her remarkable success, however, became an insidious trap. Each breathtaking sculpture demanded a deeper plunge into the drug-induced dissociative states that fueled her raw, compelling vision. You watch her, increasing her doses, not for pleasure, you understand, but out of a desperate, artistic necessity. The heroin became as vital to her process as the clay she shaped or the water she used to smooth its surface. Without it, her hands trembled too violently to create anything. With too much, consciousness would simply vanish, leaving her staring blankly at formless lumps. The previous hours, a complete void. It was a cruel irony, wasn't it? At just 28, possessing the perfect confluence of technical mastery and emotional depth, Eliza stood at the precipice of true artistic greatness. Yet she was irrevocably ensnared in a cycle where each triumph demanded a toll that made the next ever more elusive. Meanwhile, behind the smoke-filled cafés and whispered transactions, the financial machinery of this intricate heroin network grew astonishingly sophisticated. Forget the crude exchange of cash. A complex barter system had blossomed, a clandestine economy where art, drugs, illicit pleasures, and crucial social connections were woven into multi-party arrangements so intricate they defied easy tracking. You might witness an American heiress, for instance, paying an exorbitant sum for a painting, the excess discreetly siphoned to procure heroin, a portion of which would then be shared with the artist and several shadowy intermediaries. The heiress, you see, gained social cachet by patronizing avant-garde art. The artists secured both their addiction and basic survival, and the dealers profited handsomely, maintaining a convenient, if transparent, deniability about their true enterprise. At the very heart of this intricate web sat figures like Henry Lost, a man whose past as a meticulous banker had, strangely enough, perfectly prepared him for orchestrating drug distribution. Henry never touched heroin himself. He considered addiction, quite pragmatically, to be bad business practice. Instead, he masterfully structured transactions, ensuring everyone's needs were met while minimizing legal exposure. You'd find him nightly, holding court from 10 until dawn at the Calf Day raves, Purdue the calf of lost dreams. Artists would approach his table, clutching their latest creations, hoping to secure an advance against future drug purchases. Henry, with a calculating glint in his eye, would assess not just the artistic merit, but the artist's potential for continued productivity. An artist showing severe signs of addiction might be, quite coldly, cut off. Not out of moral concern, you understand, but because investing in someone nearing complete physical collapse was, simply put, a financially unsound decision. This chilling calculation permeated every facet of Henry's operation. He meticulously maintained detailed ledgers of customer reliability, tracking which artists could be trusted to deliver promised works and which were destined to vanish into a heroin-induced haze. He diligently monitored market trends, not just in legitimate art sales, but in the ever-fluctuating street drug prices, adjusting his own rates accordingly. Most crucially, he cultivated an extensive network of corrupt officials, invaluable assets, who provided advance warnings of police raids or impending regulatory shifts. His success, naturally, spawned a host of imitators throughout the bustling Latin Quarter. By 1926, the area buzzed with the dark energy of at least a dozen such cafés, each carving out its own niche. Caf Noir * catered to wealthy tourists seeking a free song of authentic bohemian danger. L'Aurore Blanche * served established artists who could afford higher quality substances. Chez Fifi * specialized in opium, offering a more languid escape. But even in this fragile ecosystem, predators emerged. Competition, you might be surprised to hear, could turn quite ugly. When Caf du Desert Mauve * dared to offer purer heroin at lower prices, directly threatening Henry's market share, a mysterious fire conveniently engulfed their kitchen, forcing a months-long closure. And when La Toile du Matin * tried luring away Henry's best clients with promises of exotic new drug combinations, several of their regular patrons suffered near-fatal overdoses, scaring away other potential clients. The violence, subtle and often disguised as unfortunate accidents or bizarre coincidences, spoke volumes. You felt the message in the air. The heroin cafe network was far too profitable, too deeply entrenched, to tolerate any significant disruption. Anyone threatening the system, you understood, would face consequences that extended far beyond mere business rivalry. This atmosphere of barely controlled chaos, this seductive dance on the edge of the abyss, attracted a very particular kind of soul. Those drawn to the heroin cafes weren't simply seeking drugs or art, you realize, but the thrill of danger itself, the ever-present possibility of overdose, arrest, financial ruin, or violent retaliation added a potent, intoxicating element that made the experience far more compelling than simple drug use or artistic appreciation alone. Jonathan Hayes, an American expatriate writer, perfectly embodied this perilous attraction. Having inherited substantial wealth, he found the predictable comforts of conventional life excruciatingly dull. He didn't come to Paris to write the great American novel. Not really. He came to live dangerously enough that he would have something truly worth writing about. And the Heroin cafés, you see, offered precisely the kind of authentic peril his soul craved. Hayes soon became a fixture at the Café de la Lune, where he quickly distinguished himself as someone willing to embrace risks that unnerved even the most seasoned addicts. You can almost see him injecting unknown substances, dabbling in perilous drug combinations, immersing himself in increasingly volatile business arrangements between dealers and artists. His writing, crafted in brief, feverish bursts of clarity between binges, captured the raw, unvarnished texture of addiction with a precision that made his work essential reading for anyone trying to truly understand the period. But Hayes's insatiable appetite for danger, you feel, eventually surpassed even his considerable resources. He became entangled in a truly reckless scheme, smuggling heroin from Germany. Hidden inside hollow picture frames, a plan destined, you suspect, for utter catastrophe. Transporting illicit substances across international borders, all while maintaining his impeccable facade as a discerning art collector. The potential profits were astronomical, dizzying sums that could transform a life, but the risks were equally immense. We're not just talking about a stretch in some dreary prison cell. Getting caught by the increasingly vigilant international authorities meant certain execution. Hayes' predicament, you see, perfectly encapsulates how the city's burgeoning heroin cafe culture had morphed far beyond simple recreational drug use or a little artistic indulgence. By the mid-1920s, it had become a shadowy, complex ecosystem, a place where people exchanged not just money for goods, but drugs, art, and the very thrill of danger as interchangeable currencies, satisfying needs far more intricate than mere chemical cravings. The most astute players in this dangerous game understood implicitly that they weren't simply buying a dose of heroin or offloading a painting. Oh no, they were actively acquiring experiences, raw, potent, forbidden sensations unobtainable through any conventional avenue. Imagine the illicit shiver of transgression, the hushed intimacy of shared secrets, the deep, satisfying warmth of belonging to an exclusive community that danced to its own clandestine rhythm. For many, the heroin itself often faded into secondary importance, paling beside the ritual surrounding its use, the crucial social connections it forged, and the potent sense of identity it bestowed upon souls feeling utterly adrift from mainstream society. This profound psychological pull, this almost spiritual dimension, rendered the cafe network far more profoundly addictive than any mere drug. Indeed, you might even say it became a sort of alternative reality. People who, against all odds, managed to break free from their chemical dependencies often found themselves inexorably drawn back, unable to resist the gravitational pull of the very social environment where those dependencies had first bloomed. These cafes offered not just a fleeting escape with a dose of heroin, but an entire, fully formed parallel universe where conventional morality, polite social expectations, and even the most fundamental economic relationships were blissfully suspended. Here, you could indulge in more immediate, intense forms of human connection, all under the soft glow of gaslight and the hum of hushed conversations. But, like all illusions, this alternative reality was destined to crumble, wasn't it? The sheer financial intricacies, the ever-escalating legal dangers, and the relentless physical toll on its participants simply made the system unsustainable. You could almost feel the impending collapse in the very air, a growing chill that crept into the once warm rooms. By 1927, cracks were starting to spiderweb across the entire network. The whispered stories of overdoses grew louder. The coffers mysteriously emptied, and the authorities, their suspicions finally peaked, began to cast their long, cold shadows over the supposedly innocent artistic cafés of the left bank. The first truly significant fissure appeared in the meticulous person of Detective Inspector Claude Bertrand, a man of quiet habits and unyielding resolve. Bertrand had dedicated 2 decades to patiently building cases against Paris's most elusive criminals, his mind a labyrinth of facts and deductions. Bohemian culture and avant-garde movements held little interest for him. The dry scent of official papers and the crisp snap of an opening file were far more appealing. What asterisk did asterisk capture his methodical attention, however, was a troubling sudden spike in overdose deaths, particularly among Paris's wealthy foreign residents. Then came the diplomatic pressure. When the American embassy, their voices tight with concern, began to lean heavily on French authorities, demanding an investigation into the deaths of 3 expatriate artists within a single bewildering month, Bertrand found himself saddled with a case. Little did he know, it would become a 2-year obsession, consuming his days and nights. His initial investigation, as you might expect, seemed to reveal nothing more than a series of tragic, yet ultimately unconnected coincidences. Young, affluent individuals, all sharing a vague interest in artistic pursuits, were simply dying from what appeared to be accidental drug overdoses. The details were frustratingly disparate. The deaths occurred in different locations, involved various substances, and offered no obvious thread of connection beyond the victim's shared passion for avant-garde culture. But Bertrand, with his 20 years navigating the city's underbelly, had learned to deeply distrust coincidences, especially, he'd observed, when large sums of money and international borders were woven into the tangled tapestry of events. He sensed a hidden pattern, a rhythm beneath the surface noise, and you could almost feel the tension in his jaw as he sifted through the reports, searching for that elusive link. His true breakthrough, the turning point, emerged from the most improbable of sources. A 70-year-old concierge named Madame Potty. She was a woman steeped in the faint scent of old dust and beeswax polish, who had spent 5 decades meticulously cleaning rooms and observing tenants at a residential hotel near the majestic Pantheon. Madame Potty possessed an almost supernatural intuition, a sixth sense for when something was genuinely amiss. One blustery afternoon, she approached Bertrand, her voice a low, concerned murmur, to express her worries about one of her long-term residents, a young German artist named Klaus Weber, who had called the hotel home for the past 18 months. Initially, Klaus had impressed Madame Potty as a serious, dedicated artista, paragon of responsibility, who paid his rent promptly and kept his studio space impeccably clean. A truly rare find, she might have thought. Yet, over the last 6 months, his behavior had veered dramatically off course. He would vanish for days, only to reappear haggard and disoriented, his eyes shadowed. Then he would spend entire weeks locked away in his room, while a parade of visitors, always impeccably dressed, often foreign, came and went at all hours. They carried packages that, to Madame Potty's discerning eye, seemed far too valuable for mere art supplies. When Bertrand finally examined Klaus's hotel registration, the paper crackling slightly under his touch, he discovered immediate discrepancies, subtle hints of false documentation. A deeper investigation swiftly revealed that Klaus Weber was merely a carefully constructed alias. His real name was Wilhelm Richter, a former German army medic who had deserted during the brutal final months of the war. Wilhelm possessed invaluable medical knowledge, making him a crucial asset to the heroin distribution network. But his precarious, illegal status in France also rendered him terribly vulnerable, a pawn susceptible to the chilling grip of blackmail and coercion. Bertrand approached Wilhelm with a careful, almost tender deliberation. He recognized that fear, not greed, was the likely puppet master behind the young man's involvement in the drug trade. You could see it etched in the lines around Wilhelm's haunted eyes. Over a series of clandestine meetings, held in small, unassuming cafés, far from the vibrant, dangerous, artistic quarter, the truth began to unravel. Wilhelm, his voice often a nervous whisper over the clinking of coffee cups, gradually exposed the intricate structure and vast scope of what he chillingly referred to as the machine, a vast distribution network that cunningly exploited artistic culture as both its camouflage and its unwitting customer base. Wilhelm's medical training had proven indispensable to the shadowy dealers who ran this operation. They needed someone capable of treating the inevitable overdoses without drawing the fatal attention of legitimate doctors, a discreet shadow healer. He'd learned to revive unconscious addicts, to manage the agonizing tremors of withdrawal symptoms, and even to perform minor surgery on customers who, in their desperate pursuits, had suffered injuries during drug-related accidents. His vital services were not paid for with money, you see, but with a far more precious currency, protection from the very authorities who would surely investigate his precarious immigration status. A deal sealed in whispered promises. Through Wilhelm's harrowing testimony, Bertrand's understanding sharpened dramatically. The cafe network wasn't just a loose collection of independent establishments. It was an integrated, hydro-headed system. Each cafe, it turned out, cleverly specialized in catering to different segments of this illicit market: the affluent tourists, the established, jaded artists, the eager young bohemians, and the hardened international dealers. Yet, despite their superficial differences, they all shared common suppliers, sophisticated enforcement mechanisms, and cunning money laundering operations that, woven together, made the entire network far more resilient than any single isolated component. The key, breathtaking insight was the ingenious way legitimate art sales were being manipulated to disguise drug transactions on an industrial scale. Imagine a small painting, perhaps genuinely worth 100 francs, would be purchased for 1,000. That extra 900 francs wasn't for the brushstrokes, was it? It was the payment for a dose of heroin. The buyer walked away with both artwork and drugs, feeling clever. The seller received both money and a manufactured social credibility as a successful artist. And the dealer, they scooped up a commission that was nearly impossible for any authority to trace. This insidious system had, in essence, created a massive artificial inflation in the Parisian art market, distorting cultural values throughout the city. Young, aspiring artists found themselves tragically unable to sell their work through legitimate channels, as collectors were now primarily interested in these drug-facilitated transactions. Meanwhile, established artists watched their market values fluctuate wildly, not based on merit, but you've heard of art being bought for passion. perhaps for prestige, but here, in the dim-lit corners of these very galleries, the true currency wasn't talent at all. It was an unspoken oath, a chilling willingness to become a cog in a vast narcotic machine. Picture the gallery owners, their faces etched with a forced smile, caught between a rock and a hard place. Either you played their game, distributing the drugs, or you watched your most lucrative patrons simply vanish into the velvet-draped shadows of rival establishments. Bertrand's investigation, a slow, methodical unraveling, began to reveal threads that snaked far beyond the bohemians and the canvases. It stretched, insidious and unseen, into the very heart of the city's financial and logistical infrastructure. Imagine the audacity. Bank officials, with their starched collars and discreet whispers, meticulously facilitating the international transfers that bankrolled these illicit drug purchases. Then, the shipping companies, their grand vessels slicing through the channel mist, unknowingly, or perhaps knowingly, ferrying heroin disguised within legitimate crates of canvases and sculptures. Even some embassy staff, cloaked in the inviolable immunity of their diplomatic status, became shadowy couriers, slipping drugs and money across borders with impunity, bypassing customs entirely. The sheer scale of the deception was dizzying, wasn't it? So vast, in fact, that Bertrand, poring over his meticulously gathered notes, felt a cold knot of doubt tighten in his stomach. Could such an elaborate criminal enterprise truly operate in plain sight, unchallenged? The answer, you see, was chillingly simple, yet deeply ingrained in the very fabric of Parisian society. It lay in the impeccable social standing of those involved, the cultured air they exuded, and the undeniable prestige linked to championing the avant-garde. The police, bless their hearts, were inherently reluctant to peer too closely into activities that seemed, on the surface, to be nothing more than sophisticated cultural patronage by the city's most prominent citizens. To question them would be to question the very elite. Meanwhile, away from the glittering facades and hushed gallery openings, a much darker, undeniable truth was emerging. The human cost of this clandestine network was beginning to pile up, tragic and impossible to ignore any longer. The tragedy that finally ripped open the veil, forcing official eyes to confront this grim reality, was the overdose of Constance Fairfax. Imagine her, the luminous daughter of a British member of Parliament, heiress to a vast shipping fortune, arriving in Paris just 6 months prior, her heart brimming with youthful idealism. She came, so she believed, to study at the Sorbonne, to immerse herself in art, and to champion the next generation of promising young talents. Instead, her lifeless body was discovered in a small studio apartment in Montmartre, the air heavy with the lingering scent of stale cigarettes and unspoken despair. She was surrounded by paintings, canvases she'd acquired for sums that, as Bertrand's team later uncovered, were a staggering 10 times their actual market value. Her death was particularly heartbreaking, wasn't it? Because Constance had actually been trying to extricate herself from that suffocating heroin-laced cafe scene when the end came. Letters, scattered across her tiny apartment, revealed her growing, painful awareness that she was being systematically fleeced, manipulated by dealers who saw her only as an endlessly deep well of wealth to be exploited. You could almost feel her growing resolve as she began to refuse the obscenely overpriced artwork, cutting off financial lifelines to several artists whose primary talent, she bitterly noted, seemed to be nothing more than consuming prodigious amounts of expensive drugs. Her final letter, addressed to her father, but never sent, painted a truly stark picture. In it, she laid bare her devastating realization. The romantic bohemian culture she had admired from afar was, in reality, nothing but an elaborate, sophisticated trap, a gilded cage designed with chilling precision to separate impressionable, wealthy young people from their money. She wrote of artists churning out mediocre work, yet commanding exorbitant prices because they could offer something far more potent than mere aesthetics: access to heroin, dealers masquerading as cultured sophisticates, running ruthless criminal enterprises, and cafe owners facilitating the quiet destruction of every soul who crossed their threshold. But Constance's attempt to break free, to disentangle herself from the insidious threads of this network, had made her dangerous. Dangerous to the very people whose comfortable livelihoods depended entirely on maintaining its impenetrable secrecy. Think about it. Her overdose occurred mere days before she was scheduled to return to London. She planned to warn other affluent families about the predatory dangers their children faced within these glittering Parisian artistic circles. The timing, you might agree, was chillingly coincidental. It whispered of something far more sinister than a mere accident, though proving deliberate murder. Finding that irrefutable thread of evidence was a challenge. Bertrand, despite his tenacity, was still desperately struggling to overcome. Constance's tragic death, in its stark finality, peeled back another layer of the network's sinister design. It revealed a methodical, almost clinical targeting of vulnerable, wealthy individuals, those who could be subtly manipulated into becoming the unwitting financial engines of the entire operation. The dealers, you see, weren't just opportunists. They were shrewd strategists. They painstakingly developed sophisticated psychological profiles of their ideal customers. They sought out those with substantial financial resources, yes, but more importantly, those who lacked emotional stability or strong, protective family connections that might interfere with their insidious exploitation. Consider the cruel irony. Young people recovering from the profound trauma of the Great War became particularly prized targets. Their deep psychological wounds, often invisible but ever present, made them tragically susceptible to the addictive whispers of heroin. And their social status, a shield in normal circumstances, became a perverse form of protection from the prying eyes of law enforcement. Imagine the vast, unseen web. Dealers cultivated networks of informants within hospitals, quietly whispering names in hushed university corridors, or observing from the fringes of exclusive social clubs. Once identified, these promising prospects would find themselves in seemingly accidental encounters, orchestrated perfectly within the city's vibrant artistic venues. There, amid the clinking glasses and the heady scent of turpentine and cheap tobacco, their initial foray into drug experimentation would be subtly presented, not as a destructive vice, but as a sophisticated, almost essential, component of cultural exploration, a way to unlock deeper perceptions. This wasn't a sudden push, mind you. The process was meticulously gradual, exquisitely managed. A wealthy young patron might spend months attending bohemian cafe events, perhaps purchasing reasonably priced artwork, pieces that were genuinely interesting, to lull them into a false sense of security, all while slowly, carefully developing relationships with artists, intellectuals, and, crucially, their new community. By the time the insidious tendrils of chemical dependency truly took root, you see, they were already profoundly, emotionally invested, not just in the fleeting euphoria, but in the entire community that had so generously provided their addiction. To even consider leaving would mean abandoning not only the drugs themselves, but their entire painstakingly constructed social identity. Their newfound support network the very sense of belonging they craved. This psychological manipulation proved infinitely more potent than simple coercion. It birthed willing participants, individuals who, even as the system steadily devoured them, would paradoxically defend it with a fervent, almost religious conviction. Artists, caught in this twisted embrace, genuinely believed they were pushing boundaries, creating revolutionary work that defied convention. Buyers, with their wallets open and their minds perhaps a little hazy, convinced themselves they were supporting vital, groundbreaking cultural movements. Even the dealers, the architects of this grand deception, maintained a straight face, asserting they were merely facilitating artistic innovation, not running cold, calculated criminal enterprises. This pervasive self-deception, this collective delusion, was cunningly reinforced by a single, undeniable truth. Some genuinely significant art was indeed being born from the very heart of this poisoned network. Imagine that, if you will. Several artists whose creations would later be hailed as historically significant had, in fact, produced their most compelling pieces while under the dark, transformative influence of heroin, obtained directly through these very café connections. This undeniable, legitimate artistic achievement became the perfect, credible cover for the broader, more sinister criminal operation. A man named Vincent Marrow, the younger brother of Jean-Baptiste, perfectly encapsulates this tragic complexity. Vincent had arrived in Paris in 1925, following his brother, his own heart full of artistic ambitions, hoping to help Jean-Baptiste recover from what their family naively believed was just a simple, war-related drinking problem. You can picture the scene. Vincent quickly discovered that Jean-Baptiste's demons ran far deeper than mere alcohol. Yet, amidst the despair and the growing shadow of addiction, he witnessed his brother creating paintings of extraordinary emotional power, works brimming with technical innovation that seemed almost impossible. Vincent found himself caught in an agonizing internal conflict, didn't he? Torn between a profound concern for Jean-Baptiste's rapidly deteriorating health and an overwhelming, almost reverent admiration for the raw, untamed brilliance of his artistic output. The heroine, it was undeniably clear, was systematically destroying his brother's body and mind. Yet it was also, paradoxically, unlocking creative capabilities that appeared utterly unattainable through conventional means. Think of the moral quandary. Jean-Baptiste's heroin-infused paintings, dripping with a haunting, raw energy, were being snapped up by serious collectors. They were even receiving critical acclaim from legitimate art critics, men and women who, in their deepest aesthetic appreciation, remained utterly oblivious to the dark secret fueling their creation. This heart-wrenching dilemma, this agonizing tightrope walk between admiration and despair, proved too much for Vincent. It drove him, inexorably, to begin his own perilous experimentation with heroin. What started as a desperate attempt to understand his brother's tortured creative process soon devolved into an end in itself, a chilling descent into the very same abyss. Vincent, though perhaps not possessing his brother's raw, natural genius, found that heroin opened new, often terrifying doors. It granted him access to intense emotional states and vivid visual perceptions that undeniably enhanced his work, pushing it beyond his natural capabilities. Within a mere few months, both brothers were inextricably intricated, caught in a devastating cycle where their artistic identity and their chemical dependency had become utterly inseparable. Their tragic saga vividly illustrates the profound corruption wrought by the café network, which didn't just destroy individuals, it consumed entire families, unraveling the very fabric of their social connections. Those who arrived in Paris with the best intentions, hoping to rescue addicted relatives, often found themselves, inevitably, drawn into the very same self-destructive community where drug use was not just tolerated, but celebrated, was normalized and even celebrated as evidence of artistic authenticity, wasn't it? Here, amidst the bohemian fervor of late 1920s Paris, the embrace of heroin wasn't just tolerated. It was practically a badge of honor, a raw, authentic edge to your art, a conduit to depths others couldn't reach. You saw it as proof of your artistic commitment, a necessary fuel for true genius. But beneath that romantic veneer, a brutal economic reality began to tighten its grip, wrapping around you like a cold, invisible chain. Try to pull away, to choose a clear mind, and suddenly your work, born of sobriety, BECAME, unsellable. The collectors, those very patrons who once lauded your drug-fueled brilliance, now simply weren't interested. They saw a lack of intensity, a dullness that sobriety, in their eyes, inexplicably brought. And it wasn't just your art that suffered, was it? Your world, once so vibrant and interconnected, began to shrink. Former friends, comrades in the haze, suddenly viewed your newfound clarity as a betrayal of shared experiences and unspoken vows. By late 1927, this intricate web of addiction and art had woven itself so tightly into the fabric of Parisian culture that distinguishing it from legitimate institutions became almost impossible. You'd stroll past a familiar café, perhaps one you frequented, only to find it expanded, its smoky back rooms now full-scale galleries mounting serious exhibitions, critics totally oblivious to the network's insidious undercurrents, penned glowing reviews, unknowingly elevating the reputations of artists deeply enmeshed in this perilous world. The most successful among you became masters of this delicate dance, pirouetting between the legitimate salon and the shadowy backroom. One morning, you might be meticulously crafting a conventional landscape, your brushstrokes precise and clear, destined for a respectable gallery. By afternoon, perhaps after a subtle signal or a shared glance, you're back in the cafe's dim light, producing those raw, drug-infused pieces that the cafe buyers craved. Evenings were a delicate performance, socializing with other addicts, maintaining the fragile pretense that your gatherings were purely intellectual. But the sheer psychological strain of constantly switching between these two versions of yourself, this perpetual masquerade, was immense, wasn't it? It gnawed at you, pushing you deeper. That constant anxiety, the exhausting mental gymnastics of presenting different faces to different worlds. It naturally accelerated your descent, didn't it? You found yourself increasing consumption, not just for inspiration, but to cope with the sheer exhaustion. Meanwhile, the financial mechanics of this elaborate network began to twist, becoming so complex that even the savviest participants lost all track of their actual economic standing. You might see a high price tag on one of your pieces, feel a surge of success, without ever realizing that most of that income was immediately recycled, flowing right back to the dealers who supplied your habit. A cruel irony, wouldn't you say? Buyers, too, were caught in this mirage. They'd lavish enormous sums, convinced they were cultivating valuable art collections, not grasping that the inflated prices made their purchases almost worthless in any legitimate market. Only the cafe owners and the dealers, those cunning puppeteers pulling the strings, possessed a crystal-clear understanding of the actual money flows. They had meticulously structured every transaction to maximize their own staggering profits, all while conjuring dazzling illusions of prosperity for everyone else. It was a masterful performance of smoke and mirrors, designed to keep you perpetually in your place, dependent on their whims. You, the artist, received just enough money to fuel your addiction and cover basic living expenses, never enough to achieve true financial independence that might allow you to actually leave this suffocating embrace. Buyers gained social status, yes, and access to exclusive experiences, but little genuine artistic value for their expenditure. The entire system was a perfectly crafted cage, designed to keep everyone dependent, locked in a continuous loop of participation, with no clear exit strategy for anyone except the dealers themselves. This economic trap, however, was only one layer. It was reinforced by a potent brew of social and psychological dependencies that made escape feel utterly impossible, even when you recognized its destructive nature. For many enmeshed in this world, the network was their entire world. Your friends were fellow participants. Your romantic relationships blossomed within its hazy confines, and your very living situation was often arranged through these intricate connections. Your days revolved around the café's shifting schedules, the ebb and flow of drug availability. Leaving meant abandoning not just the addiction, but every meaningful relationship, every social connection you had meticulously built here in the vibrant, yet ultimately suffocating, embrace of Paris. The isolation you'd face, especially if you were a foreigner, was particularly severe, leaving you feeling utterly adrift, a ship without a rudder. Think of the American expatriates, those who deliberately burned their bridges back home, dreaming of a bohemian idol, now utterly trapped, with no enter with those of destroying them as done or more it was and of you being to a pisal and wab and ruin mouth but I so and it up go if you go but up to you like I tell you I will well if you papa what I pop you if you if to it what if you had that about you but I must not but I to do in the what up to you ask you if you if the die if they you have people made that what you this best book. If I was to be what if I wished or the British aristocrats who'd scandalized their social circles by embracing this avant-garde chaos, now unable to return without confessing their disgrace. As 1928 dawned, a palpable tension began to ripple. Increased police attention, the tragic mounting toll of overdose deaths, and the sheer financial unsustainability of it all was creating pressures the system couldn't absorb indefinitely. A storm was brewing. You could almost taste it in the stale air. But you, so deeply embedded in its social and economic structures, so thoroughly consumed by the daily grind and the numbing haze of addiction, found it nearly impossible to achieve the clarity needed to recognize the approaching collapse. The stage was set, wasn't it, for a dramatic confrontation between the forces trying to preserve this delicate, dangerous balance, and those working to tear it all down. Hundreds of lives, and just as many artistic legacies, hung precariously in the balance. And then the crisis began, as often happens, with something seemingly insignificant, a single photograph that would change everything. It was February 1928, a brutal rainstorm lashing against the cobblestones, when freelance journalist Paul Duran stumbled into the Café de la Revue Perdue at 3 a.m, seeking nothing more than shelter. The damp chill of the night clung to his coat as he pushed through the heavy door. The air inside hit you, thick and cloying with stale opium, tobacco smoke, and the faint, metallic temps of unwashed bodies. You'd need a moment to adjust your eyes to the dim, flickering gaslight. But what he witnessed in that upper room was unlike anything he had ever encountered. He had his compact Leica with him, always at his side, usually for street scenes or architectural details. In a dimly lit corner, a young woman in an expensive silk dress lay unnaturally still, unconscious. A man in a paint-splattered smock injected something into her arm. Your gaze might then drift to a nearby table where three figures' eyes rolled back in chemical ecstasy past a single needle amongst themselves, like some twisted communion chalice. But the most shocking sight was a teenage boy, no older than 16, meticulously preparing heroin. An older man watched approvingly. The boy's hands moved with practiced precision. This ritual was clearly well rehearsed. His expensive clothes hinted at wealthy family connections, yet his face bore the hollow, wasted expression of advanced addiction, a stark contrast that chilled you to the bone. It was a scene of raw, unflinching depravity. Duran, almost instinctively, without really thinking, raised his camera. Asterisk, click, asterisk. The sudden, blinding flash of the Leica's bulb ripped through the heavy, stagnant air, illuminating the horrific tableau for a split second, etching it into the world's memory. Then, as if a spell had been broken, shouts immediately filled the room, shattering the drug-induced silence into a cacophony of fear and panic. Chaos. Absolute chaos. The air, thick with the scent of stale tobacco smoke and cheap perfume, crackles with sudden, frantic energy. You can almost feel the collective intake of breath, then the scramble, the rustle of silk, the clatter of dropped glasses, the hushed whispers of panic as people surge towards shadowy back exits, desperate to disappear into the labyrinthine streets of Paris. But it's too late, isn't it? You, with your quick lens and even quicker wit, have just captured something truly devastating. A single, undeniable image, destined to shatter an entire empire built on artistic pretense and a pervasive fog of chemical dependency. This wasn't just about illicit substances. It was a window into a far darker truth. This photograph, you quickly realize, exposes a systematic exploitation, a calculated predation on vulnerable young souls by adults who had twisted the very essence of artistic culture into a weapon for their criminal ends. Look closely. The boy in the image, pale and withdrawn, will soon be identified as Philippe Rothschild, a name that, let's be honest, resonates with immense power and influence. He's the heir to a banking fortune, the son of one of France's most prominent families. His shocking presence in that clandestine café ignites a series of questions, silent at first, but soon to reverberate with destructive force through the highest echelons of French society. Philippe's story, you'll discover, tragically embodies the network's insidious evolution. He'd arrived in Paris the previous autumn, the crisp, cool air carrying the scent of damp leaves and distant wood smoke through the boulevards. He was supposedly here to immerse himself in literature at the Séance. But the truth was far grimmer. He was fleeing a brewing family scandal, a quiet storm of financial irregularities swirling around his father's bank. Just 16 years old, he possessed both unimaginable wealth and a profound, aching emotional vulnerability. Can you imagine a more perfect, more tragic target for the cafe operators? These master manipulators who specialized in identifying and exploiting such individuals. His recruitment, you see, followed a chillingly familiar pattern. It always begins so innocently, doesn't it? Initial contact was made through seemingly harmless cultural events, poetry readings, art exhibitions, where the scent of canvas and turpentine mingled with the murmur of sophisticated conversation. He met charming artists and intellectuals, older, worldly figures, who appeared genuinely captivated by his nascent thoughts on literature and philosophy. These new friends then, ever so gently, introduced him to increasingly exclusive gatherings. Here, amidst the dim gaslight and the hum of hushed music, drug use was never presented as simple addiction. No, it was hailed as a sophisticated exploration of consciousness, a daring plunge into the artistic sublime. Philippe's youth made him tragically susceptible to both the subtle pressure of his peers and the overt manipulation of these older, more experienced adults. They possessed a knowledge, a worldly wisdom that he so desperately craved. When they suggested that true artistic understanding, genuine creative insight, demanded direct experience with mind-altering substances, he accepted their guidance without question. Why wouldn't he? They were the gatekeepers to the world he yearned for. But his value, you quickly discern, extended far beyond his impressionable mind. His prodigious financial resources made him an asset, a critical cog in their machine. As a mere customer, Philippe granted them access to invaluable banking connections, facilitating international money transfers that would otherwise be impossible. His family's properties, sprawling and discreet, could serve as ideal storage locations for their illicit goods. And his social connections, the very fabric of his aristocratic life, provided entry into exclusive circles previously inaccessible to the network's shadowy operatives. Within a mere few months, the tragic transformation was complete. He had become not just another addict, a victim of their calculated schemes, but an active, if unwitting, participant in the very criminal enterprise that ruthlessly fed his destructive habit. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? The photograph's subsequent publication in Le Figaro, didn't just create a sensation within Paris's bohemian artistic circles. It detonated like a bomb. You could practically hear the collective gasp across the city. Philippe's family, reeling from the scandal, immediately dispatched their best private investigators, a desperate scramble to uncover how their son had become entangled in such sordid activities. Suddenly, other wealthy families began to scrutinize their own children's flirtations with Parisian bohemian culture. A chilling wave of suspicion washing over the city's elite. Embassy officials, their diplomatic calm shattered, demanded urgent explanations for what appeared to be the deliberate targeting of their citizens by French criminals. But the most damaging revelation of all, the one that turned murmurs into shouts of outrage, was the discovery that this network had been systematically exploiting minors. Philippe, it turned out, was not an isolated case. The burgeoning investigation quickly unearthed evidence of at least a dozen other teenagers from equally prominent families, all of whom had been drawn into these cafe-based drug operations. The calculated exploitation of children transformed what had previously been dismissed as merely adult vice, a decadent indulgence, into something far more serious, far more morally repugnant in the eyes of both law enforcement and an increasingly furious public. Detective Inspector Bertrand, a man who preferred quiet diligence to public spectacle, suddenly found himself at the very epicenter of an international incident. Foreign governments, their diplomatic cables humming with indignation, were demanding immediate action against what they vehemently characterized as organized predation on their citizens' children. The relentless pressure from abroad forced the French authorities to abandon their previous, almost polite, reluctance to investigate activities involving prominent cultural figures. Resources that had been conspicuously denied to Bertrand's investigation just weeks prior were now suddenly, miraculously, made available. You could feel the shift, couldn't you? This new, unexpected surge of support came with diplomatic backing for actions that, under normal circumstances, might have severely offended influential people. The investigation's scope expanded dramatically, like a dark stain spreading across a pristine tablecloth. Bertrand, now armed with unprecedented access to banking records, cryptic shipping manifests, and even sensitive diplomatic correspondence, began to piece together the true, horrifying extent of the network's operations. What had initially appeared to be merely a collection of eccentric bohemian cafés was, in reality, a sophisticated international criminal organization. Its artistic facade was nothing more than clever camouflage for a multifaceted enterprise involving drug trafficking, intricate money laundering schemes, and systematic fraud on an astonishing scale. The financial analysis, once the cold, hard numbers began to emerge, was particularly damning. Over the preceding 3 years, an astonishing sum of approximately 2 million francs had flowed through the network's affiliated accounts. This was far, far more money than could ever be legitimately explained by art sales, even at the most exorbitant prices. Much of this vast fortune, you discover, had been systematically siphoned from wealthy young people like Philippe, their trust funds and generous family allowances ruthlessly drained to support a sprawling operation that extended far beyond the romantic gaslit streets of Paris. It paints a bleak picture, doesn't it? Shipping records, meticulously cross-referenced, then painted an even more sinister picture. They revealed regular deliveries of what were ostensibly art supplies originating from Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. But these crates and parcels, rather than holding tubes of paint or rolls of canvas, actually contained pharmaceutical-grade heroin and cocaine. A bitter irony for a network that claimed to celebrate art. These illicit shipments were expertly coordinated with the arrival of wealthy tourists and expatriates whose spending patterns had been carefully, almost scientifically, monitored by network operatives discreetly embedded in hotels, banks, and exclusive social clubs throughout the city. It was a well-oiled machine. Isn't that just like history? Perhaps the most shocking discovery, the one that truly turned the stomach, was the profound extent to which legitimate cultural institutions had been compromised by these illicit activities. Several highly respected galleries, pillars of the Parisian art scene, were found to have been actively facilitating drug transactions, cleverly disguised as art sales. Museum curators, figures once held in high esteem, had been accepting bribes to provide fraudulent authentication for artworks whose values were artificially inflated, all designed to mask large drug payments. Even some art critics, supposed guardians of taste and integrity, had been paid handsomely to write glowing, favorable reviews of network-affiliated artists, fabricating false reputations to prop up the entire rotten criminal enterprise. And then the rot was found to extend even deeper, reaching into the very heart of law enforcement itself. Bertrand's relentless investigation uncovered that several police officials, men sworn to uphold the law, had been receiving regular payments, their job, to conveniently ignore the network's activities, or, even worse, to provide advanced warning of planned raids. This, you realize, with a sinking feeling, explained precisely how these cafés had managed to operate so brazenly, so openly for years, without any significant interference from the very authorities who were supposedly monitoring criminal activity within their jurisdictions. It was a betrayal from within. The revelation of such widespread police corruption triggered an unprecedented crisis within the prefecture, threatening to destabilize law enforcement across the entirety of Paris. Officials who had been compromised, their reputations now in tatters, faced not only devastating criminal charges, but the complete and utter destruction of their careers and personal lives. Some, rather than endure the public humiliation and severe consequences of their involvement in activities that had so shamelessly facilitated the exploitation of children and the corruption of cherished cultural institutions, chose to end their own lives, a chilling, silent toll. Meanwhile, as the walls began to close in, the network's remaining participants were finally beginning to grasp that their carefully constructed world was collapsing around them. The relentless glare of Duran's published photograph had made any continued operations impossible, a spotlight too bright to hide from. Yet, many of those entangled were either too deeply addicted to the very drugs they trafficked, or too financially dependent on the crumbling system to simply walk away. Their desperate, last-ditch attempts to maintain operations, rather than saving them, only accelerated the network's destruction as their frantic activity attracted even more official attention. The end was nigh. Henry Lacoste, the former banker who had meticulously managed the network's complex financial operations from the dimly lit Café des Rêves, Purdue's The Café of Lost Dreams, was one of the first to recognize the situation's utter hopelessness. In March 1928, amidst the spiraling chaos, he quietly liquidated his assets and vanished from Paris, leaving behind only a cryptic note, a final whisper in the wind. And just like that, a simple note, perhaps left casually on a polished mahogany desk or tucked beneath a discarded art catalog, signaled Henry's discreet exit. He was, as the message suggested, returning to the world of legitimate finance, to a place where *Kel, surprise artistic appreciation didn't require the dubious enhancement of a syringe or a carefully rolled cigarette. But for the others, for YOU and your network, this wasn't a moment of quiet retirement. It was a tremor, a sudden, chilling realization that a man who knew everything, every hidden ledger, every whispered debt, every secret arrangement, was now utterly beyond your reach. The air in those smoke-filled back rooms must have thickened with a palpable dread, panic, a cold dread that crept into your bones, quickly set in. If Henry, the meticulous banker, could simply vanish, what hope did you have? You saw others, key figures, whose names now barely register in the whispers of history, attempt their own desperate flights. But they lacked Henry's intricate financial mind, his web of international connections. They fumbled, they were clumsy. Their hurried departures, far from providing escape, only laid bare more evidence, revealing deeper layers of your criminal enterprise to the very authorities you sought to evade. Imagine the chaos they left behind, the overturned tables, the forgotten documents, the lingering scent of fear and stale tobacco. Without the steady hand of experienced managers, the remaining cafés began to unravel. The delicate veneer of bohemian charm, already thin, cracked and crumbled, revealing an ugly desperation underneath. You'd notice the subtle shift, the clatter of a dropped tray becoming sharper, the hushed conversations turning into strained arguments. Drug quality, once meticulously controlled, became erratic, a dangerous game of chance as suppliers lost faith in the network's ability to settle its accounts. Then came the inevitable, brutal violence, the flash of a knife in a shadowed alley, the muffled thud against a wall, as different factions clawed at each other, vying for control of the dwindling, yet still lucrative, operations. And worst of all, the exploitation of those wealthy. Vulnerable young people you'd so carefully cultivated grew aggressive, blatant, a frantic scramble to extract every last franc before the entire rotten structure imploded. This, my friend, was the final, most tragic act. It was during this desperate phase that Marie-Claire Dubois entered the scene, an unwitting lamb drawn into the lion's den. You remember her, Eliza's younger sister, fresh-faced and determined, stepping off the train in Paris with the earnest hope of rescuing her sibling. The family, bless their naive hearts, believed Eliza's struggles were merely an artistic temperament, not the suffocating grip of addiction. Marie-Claire had no grand artistic talent, no vast fortune to offer, but she possessed something just as valuable to the network: youth, beauty, and a desperate, unconditional love for her sister. You and your operators, with your predatory instincts honed to a razor's edge, saw her instantly. She was someone who could be manipulated, not with money, but with the potent currency of emotion. Her story, you'd later discover, mirrored dozens of others, a chillingly effective blueprint for psychological exploitation. Marie-Claire was slowly, almost imperceptibly, drawn into the intoxicating pulse of café society, her initial visits genuinely rooted in concern for Eliza. Then came the insidious whispers: to truly help your sister, you must understand her world. You must experience it. Her initial resistance, a fragile shield of innocence, was systematically eroded by a carefully orchestrated campaign of peer pressure and emotional blackmail. Drug use was subtly reframed, presented as a profound act of love, loyalty, a shared journey with Eliza. Within weeks, Marie-Claire, believing she was conducting vital research to save her sister, was herself a heroin addict. The final months of the Dubois sisters were a shared, heartbreaking delusion. You can almost see them, slumped together in a dimly lit room, perhaps a single gaslight casting long, dancing shadows, each convinced they were helping the other, each spiraling faster towards the abyss. They believed their shared drug use was therapeutic, a twisted form of communion, while the network your network, slowly drained them of life and hope. Their deaths, occurring within days of each other in April 1928, weren't just a tragedy. They were a stark, brutal epitaph to the network's power, a testament to its ability to corrupt even the purest of intentions. These deaths marked a seismic shift in public perception, a turning point that reverberated through the very foundations of Parisian society. Before the Dubois sisters, the casualties of the network could be dismissed as the unfortunate consequences of adult choices, the self-inflicted wounds of a decadent generation. But Marie-Claire's story, so pure in its motivation, revealed something far more sinister, a system that actively recruited and destroyed individuals whose only transgression was loving someone already ensnared. It transformed drug trafficking from a simple criminal enterprise into something akin to a contagious disease, spreading insidiously through the very social connections that bind us. Imagine the outrage, the fury, bubbling up from the city's elegant salons to its grittiest streets. Detective Inspector Bertrand, a man whose patience had long worn thin, seized upon this public fury, using cases like the Dubois sisters to justify an aggressive escalation of his investigation. The crisp morning air of May 1928 must have crackled with anticipation, a tension you could almost taste before simultaneous raids swept across 12 network-affiliated locations. Over 60 people were arrested in a whirlwind of sudden arrests, the clanging of cell doors echoing through the city. Crucially, vast amounts of evidence were seized: ledgers, coded messages, whispered confessions. Finally, piecing together the complete, horrifying picture of your organization's structure and operations. The revelations were chilling, a testament to just how far the network had evolved. What began as casual drug dealing in dimly lit bohemian cafés had metastasized into a sophisticated criminal enterprise. You might have thought it was just a loose collection of opportunists, but the evidence showed meticulous operational procedures, intricate financial management systems, and even long-term strategic planning capabilities. Imagine the sheer audacity: detailed records of customer preferences, spending patterns, their deepest psychological vulnerabilities, all cataloged, all used to extract every last cent. Personnel files evaluated employees on their ability to manipulate employees, specifically to manipulate spictimuses, plutuses, bonuses, pluides of sissises, nusely of that. Ulissa bisisacrin is core, quidisacandi, quid pleipsilin, gavayam, you agam. Pika with good work of it to you to batu if to the view to fight to the we bad mama but if not without tapatly what I could we pay if we for that but it was a cold, calculated machine. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery, the one that sent shivers down the spines of even hardened investigators, were the planning documents. They laid bare the network's chilling ambition, an intention to expand far beyond the gaslit alleys of Paris. Similar cafe-based operations, leveraging every lesson learned from the Parisian experiment, were being carefully cultivated in London, New York, and Berlin. This wasn't just about drugs. It was about packaging the systematic exploitation of artistic culture as a replicable business model, a perverse franchise designed to target any city teeming with wealthy, culturally aspiring young people. You realize now, don't you, that this elevated the investigation from a local Parisian police matter to an international security concern. Foreign governments, who had previously issued polite, if firm, diplomatic démarches demanding action on the exploitation of their citizens, now faced a stark reality. The threat wasn't just asterisk over their asterisk. It was on their doorstep, threatening their own territories. Diplomatic cooperation, once limited to demands for France to clean up its act, suddenly expanded, transforming into robust intelligence sharing and coordinated international law enforcement efforts. The network's collapse, once an inevitability, accelerated dramatically as participants realized continued involvement meant not just criminal prosecution, but the very real specter of deportation and international scandal, a stain that would permanently destroy their reputations. The psychological fallout, you might realize now, often far outweighed the financial consequences for those caught in its web. Artists who had depended on drug-facilitated sales, once so vital to their extravagant lifestyles, found themselves adrift. Their clientele vanished, legitimate galleries shunning anyone tainted by the scandal. But deeper still was the profound disillusionment. People who had meticulously constructed their entire identities around membership in what they believed was an exclusive, sophisticated artistic community discovered it had been a meticulously engineered trap. The treasured relationships, those deep conversations they believed were evidence of profound cultural understanding, were revealed to be nothing more than cold, calculated business arrangements, designed solely to separate them from their money and their independence. It was a betrayal of the soul. And here, we circle back to Jean-Baptiste Moreau, the war veteran whose initial encounter with heroin at the Café de l'Amour launched our entire journey into this shadowed world. He epitomized both the network's destructive power and, remarkably, the very possibility of redemption that emerged from its ashes. Jean-Baptiste was among the first wave arrested in those May raids, a pawn in a much larger game. But his willingness to cooperate, his desperate need to unburden himself, earned him a leniency that offered him a chance at recovery, a path away from extended imprisonment. His testimony, offered in hushed tones behind closed doors, provided crucial, harrowing insights into the network's evolution from a simple drug ring to a systematic criminal enterprise. He described, in painful detail, the gradual, almost imperceptible transformation of Paris's vibrant café culture. It began as a genuine artistic community, a place of shared dreams and fiery debates, slowly, insidiously, twisting into a predatory business operation. Jean-Baptiste explained how the operators, your shadowy figures, had learned to identify and exploit the specific vulnerabilities that made artists, writers, and those wealthy young dilettantes so susceptible to manipulation. But, most importantly, Jean-Baptiste's arduous journey to recovery offered a glimmer of hope. It demonstrated, unequivocally, that escape from the network was, in fact, possible, though it, imagine, for a moment, the immense courage it took for a man like Jean-Baptiste to step away from it all. He wasn't just giving up a habit, he was shedding an entire identity, a persona woven into the very fabric of 1920s Parisian artistic life, that intoxicating myth, that true genius bloomed, that true boons of substance of so widden subinens, of subins to be secune of subiblican of sedun baron is bebotend of satin of iron and of you and a do give a cup of the pip to pava that but I did that to it but I picked you up but you take you I acquire up on was the you side but if I will you got but I the true if I papa if you me that you that a bit bad about it but the power of the you with it man that but it my power you might find yourself in his quiet studio, the faint scent of turpentine replacing the cloying sweetness of opium. His hands, steadier now, guided brushes across canvases that perhaps lacked the frenetic, otherworldly intensity of his drug-fueled visions. But look closer. These new works thrummed with a raw, undeniable honesty, a technical mastery that proved talent didn't need chemical crutches. It was genuine, undeniably their asterisk, and his triumph, that clear-eyed commitment to a different path, became a beacon. A quiet ripple began, wasn't it? Other survivors of the network, those who'd also danced too close to the flame, watched him. They saw a flicker of hope in his revitalized art and dared to believe that they too could rebuild their lives. A small, resilient community started to form, supported by legitimate cultural institutions that saw the desperate need for an alternative to the toxic glamour of the café underworld. This burgeoning group, living proof of recovery, dared to openly challenge one of the network's most insidious lies, the seductive whisper that drugs were essential for true artistic expression. Artists who once thought their finest work emerged from heroin's grip now found that sobriety, though less spectacular in the moment, fostered a more consistent, sustainable development of their craft. But here's the cruel twist of fate, isn't it? The network's collapse, while necessary, also plunged many into unforeseen hardship. Think of those artists, once celebrated with inflated prices that seemed to promise success, now standing in front of conventional galleries, their work no longer fetching those unsustainable sums. The artificial scaffolding of their livelihoods had been violently kicked away, leaving them utterly unprepared for the harsh realities of a normal economy. You can almost feel the chill wind of poverty creeping into their once vibrant studios, hear the whispers of social isolation, and see the weariness etched onto faces grappling with newfound health problems. For some, the devastation was simply too profound to overcome. The network, despite its sinister undercurrents, had offered a perverse kind of community, identity, and economic lifeline. To simply sever the criminal threads without replacing the genuine, albeit twisted, benefits it provided meant tearing away the only support system many people knew. This human cost, both of the network's operation and its sudden demise, forced society to confront some deeply uncomfortable questions. How do artistic culture, mental health, economic vulnerability, and criminal exploitation intertwine in such a complex, devastating dance? As the investigators dug deeper, the answers grew even more disturbing, didn't they? The network's tendrils extended far beyond mere drug trafficking and financial sleight of hand. Imagine the quiet click of a hidden camera, the rustle of carefully collected dossiers. This wasn't just about art and addiction. It was about power. They had systematically amassed a terrifying trove of intelligence on wealthy families, high-ranking government officials, and even esteemed cultural institutions. These weren't mere files. They were assets, tools for blackmail, political manipulation, and even industrial espionage. The collapse had thankfully prevented these capabilities from fully blooming, but their mere existence revealed a chilling truth. These cafe-based criminal organizations weren't just a threat to individual welfare. They posed a genuine risk to national security. The revelations sent shockwaves across Europe, fundamentally altering how authorities perceived the shadowy intersection of cultural life and criminal enterprise. Suddenly, police departments weren't just chasing petty thieves. They were establishing specialized units, their officers trained to spot how legitimate artistic communities, those vibrant hubs of creativity, could be subtly infiltrated and exploited. Educational institutions, too, stepped up crafting programs to equip young, impressionable minds with the awareness to resist the manipulation techniques that so expertly targeted their yearning for sophistication and belonging. But perhaps the most profound shift was a broader, societal introspection. Let's be honest, the network hadn't just succeeded because its operators were cunning manipulators. It thrived because post-war society itself had failed to adequately support a generation scarred by trauma, economic insecurity, and profound social alienation. Those wealthy young people, drawn into its orbit, weren't simply victims of criminal predation. They were casualties of a deeper cultural crisis. They were searching for meaning, for identity, in the bewildering aftermath of unprecedented upheaval, and the network had offered them artificial solutions to very real, very human problems. Understanding this broader context, you see, was absolutely essential. Merely prosecuting the criminals wouldn't fix the underlying cracks that made their operations possible. Society needed to build legitimate alternatives, real communities, authentic identities, and genuine economic opportunities. And so, the cafe network's dark legacy stretched far beyond the broken lives and tainted institutions it left behind. It offered a chilling demonstration of how criminal organizations could deftly exploit cultural prestige and social status, cloaking nefarious activities in an aura of sophistication that made them harder to recognize as dangerous. This insight would prove invaluable as authorities encountered similar schemes across other cities and cultural movements throughout the tumultuous 20th century.